Welcome to the Life Paradox, where reality is stranger than fiction. James Fletcher stared at the clock on the wall, panic rising in his chest. His babysitter had just called to cancel, and his shift at the hospital started in 45 minutes. 3-year-old Theo sat on the living room floor, stacking blocks, with careful concentration, blissfully unaware of his father's mounting anxiety. "What am I going to do with you, buddy?" James whispered, running his fingers through his hair. Since Emma's death 18 months ago, he'd been barely keeping their lives together. The medical bills from her illness had drained their savings, and now he was working double shifts as an orderly just to make rent on their small apartment. Desperation drove him to bundle Theo into a jacket and rush to the park across the street. Perhaps Mrs. Gould would watch Theo. She'd helped before in emergencies. The November air bit at their cheeks as they hurried along the path. Mrs. Gould wasn't at her usual bench, but someone else was, a woman in a worn coat, reading a tattered paperback. James had seen her before. Beth was her name. She lived in the shelter 2 blocks over but spent days in the park when weather permitted. Several times James had brought her coffee on cold mornings. She'd always been kind to Theo, sometimes folding paper animals for him from discarded newspapers. "Mr. Fletcher," she nodded, closing her book. "You're in a hurry this morning." James explained his predicament, words tumbling out in desperate haste. Beth studied his face for a moment, then looked at Theo. "I could watch him," she offered quietly. James hesitated. Beth wasn't a stranger exactly, but he knew almost nothing about her beyond casual park encounters. "I was a pediatric nurse for 18 years, she added, seeming to read his thoughts. "Before everything changed." Every paradox begins with a question. If you love unraveling life's biggest mysteries, hit subscribe and join the Life Paradox, where every story bends reality. James felt the weight of his options or lack thereof. He was about to lose his job if he missed another shift, and something in Beth's eyes reflected a sincerity he couldn't ignore. "Just for today," he said finally, handing her his spare key. "Emergency numbers are on the fridge. Theo has lunch. At noon, nap at 2. I'll be back by 6. Beth nodded solemnly. "We'll be fine." Throughout his shift, James checked his phone obsessively, half expecting disaster. When he finally returned home, exhausted and still uncertain about his decision, he found his apartment tidier than he'd left it. Theo was bathed and in pajamas, eagerly showing off a small army of paper animals. "She makes the best elephants, Daddy," Theo exclaimed. Beth stood in the kitchen doorway, looking uncertain. "I hope you don't mind. I found some spaghetti and made dinner." The smell of warm food hit James, and he realized he hadn't eaten a proper homemade meal in weeks. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for the relief he felt. As they ate, Beth mentioned casually that she had nowhere to be if he needed help again tomorrow. Something in her voice, hopeful yet hesitant, made James pause. "Maybe we could work something out," he said carefully. "A temporary arrangement." Neither of them realized then how that simple suggestion would alter the course of all their lives, or that temporary would stretch into something much more permanent. 3 years passed with the gentle rhythm of seasons changing outside their apartment window. What had begun as desperation transformed into an arrangement that defied conventional explanation. Beth no longer lived at the shelter. Instead, the small storage room off the kitchen had been converted into her quarters, sparse but private, with a window that caught the morning light. In exchange for room and board, she cared for Theo while James worked. Her medical background proved invaluable when Theo developed asthma, her steady hands administering treatments with professional precision. On a warm spring evening, James returned home earlier than usual to find Beth and Theo sitting cross-legged. On a blanket in the living room, a tattered atlas open between them. "And this," Beth was saying, her finger tracing the outline of a continent, "is where the longest river in the world flows." "The Nile," Theo answered confidently, now a bright 6-year-old with his mother's dark curls and his father's serious eyes. James leaned against the doorframe, watching them. There was something about the scene that made his throat tighten, a glimpse of normalcy he'd never expected to find again after Emma died. Later that night, after Theo was asleep, Beth and James sat at the kitchen table with mugs of tea between them. "He asked about my past today," Beth said quietly. "About why I was homeless." James had never pressed for details. He knew bits and pieces, that she'd been a nurse, that there had been a husband named Ray, that something had gone terribly wrong. "What? Did you tell him?" James asked. Beth stared into her mug. "The truth, that my husband got sick, that the insurance didn't cover enough, that I spent everything trying to save him, and when that failed, there was nothing left." Her voice remained steady, but James could see the cost of that steadiness in the whiteness of her knuckles around the mug. "After the funeral, I kept working, kept paying bills. Then I got sick, just pneumonia. But I missed weeks of work. By the time I recovered, my position had been filled. Without references, the hospital was downsizing. I couldn't find similar work. It happened so fast." James reached across the table, covered her hand with his, a gesture of understanding between two people who had watched their lives crumble for loving someone too much. "You're not there anymore," he said simply. Beth looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "No. But sometimes I wonder if I'm taking advantage. You and Theo. You gave me a lifeline when I was drowning." "We were drowning too," James admitted. "You helped us find shore." That night marked a shift in their household, an acknowledgement that what had begun as mutual convenience had evolved into something deeper. Beth had become more than Theo's caretaker. She was family. Not in a romantic sense. James still wore his wedding ring, and Beth kept Ray's photo beside her bed, but in the way that shared struggles forged connections stronger than blood. The next morning, James registered Beth as Theo's emergency contact at school, listing her as family friend. The form felt inadequate to describe what she had become to them, but it was a start. Through Beth, Theo learned compassion beyond his years. He never hesitated to share his lunch with classmates who forgot theirs, and once gave his new winter coat to a boy waiting at the bus stop without one. When James questioned this impulsive generosity, Theo shrugged with the simple wisdom of childhood. "Beth says we help because we can, and because someday we might be the ones needing help." James couldn't argue with that truth. Theo's 7th birthday party had just ended, the apartment still decorated with blue balloons and superhero streamers. James collected paper plates while Theo arranged his gifts on the coffee table, meticulously organizing them by size. "You have fun, buddy?" James asked, ruffling his son's hair. Theo nodded enthusiastically. "Best birthday ever. Even Tommy from my class came, and he never comes to parties." Beth emerged from the kitchen carrying a trash bag. "That's because you're special, Theo." Her voice held the warmth it always did when she spoke to the boy. Over the years, James had watched Beth gradually reclaim parts of herself that homelessness had stripped away. Her confidence had returned, along with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. She'd maintained connections at the shelter where she'd once stayed, volunteering there twice weekly. The staff valued her medical knowledge and her unique capacity to connect with residents who distrusted the system. The doorbell rang unexpectedly. James frowned. All the party guests had left an hour ago. Beth set down the trash bag. "I'll get it." When she opened the door, James heard her sharp intake of breath before she spoke. "Frank? What are you doing here?" James moved to the entryway, where an elderly man stood leaning heavily on a cane. His clothes were clean but worn, his face weathered by years spent outdoors. Despite his apparent fragility, his eyes were alert and intelligent. "Beth," the man said, his voice surprisingly strong. "I wouldn't have come if I had anywhere else to go." Beth turned to James, her expression troubled. "This is Frank Miller. We knew each other at the shelter." Frank extended a trembling hand. You must be James. Beth speaks highly of you. James shook the offered hand, noting its unexpected strength despite the tremor. Come in, he said, more out of politeness than welcome. In the living room, Theo looked up from his presence, curious about their visitor. Hello, young man, Frank said, lowering himself carefully onto the sofa. I see it's your birthday. What fine gifts you have there. Theo approached cautiously. I'm 7 today. A magnificent age, Frank replied. The very best, in my opinion. While Theo showed Frank his presents, Beth pulled James into the kitchen, her voice low and urgent. I'm sorry to spring this on you. Frank's been in the hospital. Pneumonia. The shelter's full tonight and he's still weak. He just needs a place for one night until his Social Security check arrives tomorrow. James glanced toward the living room, where Frank was demonstrating a card trick for an enthralled Theo. You trust him? James asked. Beth nodded without hesitation. With my life. When I first became homeless, Frank looked out for me. Showed me which shelters were safe, which soup kitchens had the best food. He's a former attorney, brilliant mind. Life just broke differently for him. James sighed. Their apartment was small, their routines established. A stranger disrupted everything. One night, he agreed reluctantly. Beth squeezed his arm gratefully. Thank you. That evening, Frank slept on their pull-out sofa. James lay awake, listening for any unusual sounds, unable to fully trust their guest, despite Beth's assurances. Around midnight, he heard movement and slipped into the hallway. Frank stood at the bookshelf, examining family photos in the dim light from the kitchen. Couldn't sleep? James asked, making Frank start. Old habits, Frank explained. I don't sleep well in new places. He gestured to a photo of Emma. Your wife was beautiful. Something in his tone, respectful, almost reverent, eased James's suspicion slightly. She was, James agreed. Cancer took her when Theo was 2. Frank nodded solemnly. I lost my Margaret 30 years ago. Car accident. He replaced the photo carefully. The pain changes shape, but it never truly leaves, does it? James felt an unexpected connection to this stranger who understood grief's permanent residence. No, he answered quietly. It doesn't. Frank returned to the sofa, and James went back to bed. One night, he reminded himself. Just one night. But as dawn broke, neither man realized that Frank's arrival had set in motion events that would unearth long-buried secrets and forever alter the delicate balance of their improvised family. One night turned into 3, then a week. Frank recovered slowly from his illness, and with each passing day, James found his initial suspicion being replaced by grudging respect. The old man was unfailingly courteous, insisted on contributing what little he could to household expenses, and had a way of engaging Theo in conversation that drew out the boy's natural curiosity. He was a brilliant attorney once, Beth explained one evening while she and James washed dishes. Corporate law, very successful. Then his wife and daughter were killed by a drunk driver. The man responsible was wealthy, connected. He got off with a suspended sentence. James passed her a plate to dry. What happened then? Frank spent years and every penny he had fighting to change the laws. When that failed, he started drinking, lost his practice, his home. By the time he got sober, there was nothing left. This story resonated with James, who understood how grief could dismantle a life piece by piece. He'd been fortunate. He'd had Theo to anchor him, and then Beth had appeared when they'd needed her most. On Friday evening, James arrived home to find Frank helping Theo with his math homework. Beth was preparing dinner, the apartment filled with the comforting smell of chicken soup. You're good at this, James remarked, watching Frank patiently guide Theo through a problem. Frank smiled wryly. Numbers always made more sense to me than people. Except for Margaret and our Kate, I understood completely. Later that night, James noticed Frank once again studying the family photos. This time, he focused on one James rarely examined. A picture of Emma with her parents, taken years before James met her. It was the only image of his in-laws in the apartment. They had disowned Emma when she chose to marry James, a blue-collar worker they deemed unsuitable for their daughter. "Your wife's family," Frank said. It wasn't a question. James nodded. "The Harrisons. They didn't approve of me. After Emma got sick, I tried reaching out. Thought they might want to know their daughter was dying. The number was disconnected." Frank's expression changed subtly. "Harrison," he repeated. "From Connecticut?" The question caught James off guard. "Yes. How did you know?" "I knew many families in my practice," Frank replied vaguely. "The name sounds familiar." Something in his tone made James uneasy. Before he could press further, Beth called them to dinner. Throughout the meal, James caught Frank watching him with an evaluating gaze. Theo chatted about school, Beth discussed her volunteer work at the shelter, but an undercurrent of tension had entered the apartment. That night, James overheard Beth and Frank talking quietly in the living room after Theo was asleep. "You have to tell him," Beth was saying. "Not yet," Frank replied. "I need to be certain. He deserves to know. And he will. But timing matters, Beth. You, of all people, understand that." James stepped into the doorway. "Tell me what?" They turned, startled by his appearance. Beth looked guilty, Frank merely thoughtful. "James," Frank began slowly, "may I ask your wife's father's name?" "Edward Harrison," James answered, confusion mingling with growing suspicion. "Why?" Frank and Beth exchanged glances. Then Frank straightened, suddenly seeming more like the attorney he'd once been than the homeless man James had reluctantly welcomed into his home. "Because 27 years ago, I represented the Harrison family in establishing a trust, a rather substantial one." Frank's eyes held James's steadily. "And if your wife was Edward Harrison's daughter, then there is something you and Theo should know." Beth moved to stand beside James, as if lending him her strength for whatever revelation was coming. "What are you saying?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying," Frank replied carefully, "that your son may be the heir to a fortune his mother never claimed, and that my appearance in your life is not the coincidence you've been led to believe." The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. That followed, marking the moment when their carefully constructed life began to unravel thread by thread. James sat motionless at the kitchen table, Frank's words hanging in the air between them. The apartment felt suddenly too small, the walls pressing inward with the weight of revelation. "This isn't a coincidence," James repeated flatly. "You sought us out." Frank nodded, his weathered hands folded calmly before him. "I've been looking for you and Theo for nearly 5 years." Beth stood by the kitchen counter, her expression torn between concern for James and what looked surprisingly like relief. "I had no idea at first," she said quietly. "Not until Frank recognized Emma's photo last week." James turned to her, betrayal flashing across his face. "But you've known for a week and said nothing?" "I asked her to wait," Frank interjected. "I needed to be certain." "Certain of what?" James demanded. Frank sighed deeply. "That you were, indeed, the James Fletcher who married Emma Harrison against her family's wishes, that Theo was their grandson." He paused. "And that you had no idea what Emma left behind." James laughed bitterly. "What she left behind was medical debt that nearly destroyed us. If there was money, don't you think she would have used it during her treatment?" Frank shook his head. "Emma may not have known the full extent of it herself. Edward Harrison was a controlling man who believed money should be earned, not inherited. When Emma defied him by marrying you, he cut her off completely. This I know, James said tersely. What you may not know is that Margaret Harrison, Emma's mother, never agreed with this decision. Without her husband's knowledge, she established a trust for Emma, accessible on her 30th birthday. Frank's voice softened. Emma died 2 months before she would have been notified. The revelation hit James like a physical blow. 2 months. 60 days that might have changed everything. That might have saved Emma with better treatment, specialists, experimental therapies. After Emma's death, Frank continued, Margaret tried to find you and Theo. By then, Edward had died, and she was determined to make amends. She hired investigators, but you'd moved after losing your house. James remembered that desperate time, changing apartments twice as he downsized, working multiple jobs, barely keeping himself and Theo afloat. Margaret died 3 years ago, Frank said. Her final request was that I continue searching for her grandson. As executor of the Harrison estate, I had a legal obligation. As someone who understood loss, I had a moral one. But you were homeless, James said, struggling to reconcile this story with the man before him. Frank smiled sadly. Life takes unexpected turns. I had indeed lost everything, just as I told you. What I didn't mention was that 2 years ago, I was contacted by the law firm I once founded. One of my former partners had died and left me a portion of his estate, enough to get back on my feet. So all this, James gestured vaguely around the apartment, was what? An elaborate scheme? To assess whether we were worthy? No, Beth interjected firmly. It was Frank finding me at the shelter and recognizing your name when I mentioned where I worked. It was coincidence at first, then confirmation when he saw Emma's photo. Frank reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope. This contains the details of Theo's inheritance. As his father and legal guardian, you'll control it until he's 25. Margaret was quite specific about the terms. James stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. How much? The original trust was for $2 million. With interest and investments over the years, it's now closer to 4.5. The amount was incomprehensible, a figure that belonged to another world, not the careful budget of monthly expenses James had lived by for years. Why should I believe any of this? He asked finally. Frank slid the envelope across the table. Inside, you'll find contact information for Harrison and Blackwell, the firm that manages the trust. Call them tomorrow. They're expecting you. James looked at Beth, whose eyes shone with unshed tears. Did you know? Before tonight? She shook her head. I only knew Frank was searching for someone. When he recognized Emma's picture, he asked me questions. About you. About Theo. I realized then there was more to his story. James stood abruptly. I need air. He walked out onto the small balcony, his mind reeling. Behind him, he heard Beth and Frank speaking in low voices, but their words didn't register. He stared at the city lights, thinking of Emma, of all she'd been through, of how hard they'd fought to save her, and how they'd ultimately failed. $4.5 million. A sum that could have changed everything, or perhaps changed nothing at all. The offices of Harrison and Blackwell occupied the 23rd floor of a gleaming downtown tower, a world away from James's life of hospital corridors and careful budgeting. The receptionist ushered him into a conference room where 2 men in expensive suits awaited. Mr. Fletcher, the older man rose, extending his hand. I'm Philip Blackwell. This is my colleague, Robert Dunn. Thank you for coming. James nodded stiffly, feeling underdressed and out of place. Frank Miller briefed us on your meeting, Blackwell continued, gesturing for James to sit. I understand this must be overwhelming. Overwhelming. Doesn't begin to cover it, James replied. For the next hour, the attorneys walked him through documents that validated everything Frank had claimed. Trust agreements, investment portfolios, property deeds, a narrative of wealth that had existed, parallel to James's struggles, separated by nothing more than pride and estrangement. "There's something else," Blackwell said finally, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. "Margaret Harrison left this for you personally." James opened it with unsteady hands. Inside was a handwritten letter on cream stationery. "Dear James, you don't know me, though we met once at Emma's graduation. I was the woman who complimented your tie and asked about your studies. Edward didn't know I approached you. I write now to express my deepest regrets. For not standing against Edward's cruelty when Emma chose you. For not finding you sooner. For the years my grandson has lived without knowing his heritage or feeling his grandmother's love. Edward died believing he was right to disown Emma. I've lived knowing we were wrong. This money cannot undo our failures, but perhaps it can secure Theo's future in ways Emma would have wanted. There is a house in Westbrook, Emma's favorite place as a child. It's included in the trust. Perhaps someday you might visit and see why she loved it so." With profound regret and hope, Margaret Harrison James refolded the letter carefully. "Did you know Emma?" he asked Blackwell. The attorney nodded. "I handled her college fund. Bright young woman, determined. When she cut ties with her family, I was instructed to cease all communication. I regretted that. Would this money have saved her?" The question had haunted James since Frank's revelation. Blackwell's expression softened. "Medical science has limitations money can't always overcome, Mr. Fletcher, but it certainly would have provided options." When James left the office, his briefcase contained documents requiring signatures, bank information for transfers, and keys to properties he hadn't known existed yesterday. The weight of it all pressed against his ribs like a physical presence. He didn't go directly home. Instead, he drove to the cemetery where Emma was buried, her modest headstone a testament to the financial constraints that had shaped their lives. Together. "Did you know?" he asked the silent stone. "Was this why you sometimes stared at the phone like you were considering a call you never made?" Only the wind answered, rustling through nearby trees. That evening, James sat Theo down to explain, in simple terms, that his mother's family had left him something special. Theo, with a child's adaptability, seemed more interested in the fact that his grandmother had owned a house near the ocean than in the abstract concept of inheritance. "Can we see it?" he asked eagerly. "Someday," James promised. After Theo was asleep, James found Beth in the kitchen, preparing lunches for the next day, a ritual she'd maintained for years. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I accused you of keeping secrets." Beth continued spreading peanut butter on wheat bread. "You had every right to be shocked. Frank says you were instrumental in helping him find us, that you recognized Emma? From his description of the Harrison case." She nodded without looking up. "I remembered you mentioning her maiden name once. When Frank described a young woman who'd married against her family's wishes, something clicked." James sat at the table, watching her hands move with familiar efficiency. The attorneys confirmed everything: Theo's inheritance, the properties, all of it. "That's good," Beth said quietly, finally meeting his gaze. "Theo deserves security." Something in her tone made James pause. "This doesn't change anything here," he said. "Our arrangement—" "Of course it does," Beth interrupted gently. "You won't need me anymore. You can afford proper childcare now, better opportunities for Theo." The thought hadn't occurred to James until that moment, that wealth might dismantle the fragile family they'd created from necessity and mutual respect. "That's not what I want," he said firmly. Beth's smile held a sadness he couldn't fully decipher. "We should discuss this later. It's been an overwhelming day." As she turned back to her task, James realized that the inheritance had given them financial security, but threatened the emotional stability they'd carefully constructed. A bitter irony that resources meant to heal one wound might inadvertently open another. 2 months after Frank's revelation, The apartment was filled with moving boxes. James had finally decided to visit the Westbrook house, not to live there permanently, but to honor Margaret's request and give Theo a summer by the ocean while they considered their options. Beth moved methodically through the kitchen, wrapping mugs in newspaper with the precision of someone who understood the fragility of possessions. She'd been quieter since the inheritance, maintaining her routines but gradually creating distance between herself and the Fletchers, subtle enough that Theo hadn't noticed, but unmistakable to James. Frank, who had moved into a modest apartment of his own after his role was revealed, sat with Theo in the living room, teaching him chess, a ritual they'd established during weekly visits. "Knight to Queen's Bishop 3, Frank instructed. "See how that protects your position?" James watched them from the hallway, struck by how natural their interaction had become. Frank had gracefully transitioned from mysterious stranger to something like a grandfather figure, filling a role neither James nor Theo had known was vacant. "You're good with him," James remarked later, when Theo had gone to help Beth pack his books. Frank's eyes crinkled with a smile. "He reminds me of my Kate. Same curiosity, same kindness." He glanced toward the kitchen. "Have you spoken with Beth about the summer arrangements?" James sighed. "She insists she needs to find her own path now. Says it's the perfect time since we'll be away." "And you believe that's her true reason?" "No." James rubbed his face tiredly. "I think she's creating distance because she believes we don't need her anymore." Frank studied the chessboard between them, moving a piece thoughtfully. "When I was practicing law, I learned that people rarely say exactly what they mean. They circle the truth, approaching it obliquely." "What's your point?" "My point is that Beth didn't join your household solely because she needed shelter. She stayed because she found purpose, something many of us spend lifetimes seeking." James considered this. "And now she thinks that purpose is fulfilled." "Precisely." Frank captured James's bishop. "The question is, are you willing to let her believe that?" Before James could answer, Beth appeared in the doorway. "Theo's asking for his dinosaur pajamas. Have you seen them?" "Top drawer of his dresser," James replied, watching her retreat. "I'll miss her," he admitted quietly to Frank. "Theo will be devastated." Frank leaned forward. "Then perhaps it's time for honesty, before paths diverge too far to reconnect." That evening, after Theo was asleep, James found Beth on the balcony, gazing at the city lights. The spring air carried the scent of blooming trees from the park across the street, the same park where they'd first spoken years ago. "Frank's finally told me the whole story," James said, joining her at the railing, "about how he found us." Beth turned, her expression guarded. "Oh?" "He says it wasn't coincidence that you ended up in my path that day in the park, that you recognized me from photographs he'd shown you." She looked away. "Not exactly. I knew your name, had seen Emma's picture. When I realized who you were, I contacted Frank." "So you planned to become Theo's caretaker?" "No." Her voice was firm. "That happened because you needed help, and I needed purpose. The arrangement was genuine. But finding us wasn't." Beth sighed deeply. Frank had been searching for months. "When I mentioned meeting a widower named Fletcher with a young son, he showed me Emma's photo from the Harrison files. I recognized her from your apartment. Everything connected. Why didn't you tell me then?" "Would you have trusted me if I had?" she challenged. "A homeless woman claiming knowledge of your wife's estranged family? You'd have thought I was running a scam." James couldn't deny the truth of this. "And later?" "Later, it never seemed the right time. You and Theo were healing. I was rebuilding my life." She paused. "Then I discovered I cared too much about both of you to risk everything with revelations. That might not matter." "But they did matter," James said quietly. "Yes. And now Theo has his birthright. And you have choices you never had before." Her voice trembled slightly. "My role here is complete. James studied her profile in the dim light. This woman who had entered their lives through what he now understood was a complex convergence of purpose and coincidence. "What if it isn't?" he asked. Beth turned to him, confusion crossing her features. "What do you mean? What if your purpose with us isn't finished? What if we still need you, not as Theo's caretaker or as a connection to Emma's past, but as Beth? As family?" Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "James, you don't have to—" "I'm not offering charity," he interrupted. "I'm asking you to continue being part of our lives, to come to Westbrook for the summer, to help us figure out what comes next." The city hummed below them, traffic lights changing from red to green to yellow, marking time as Beth considered his words. "Family," she repeated softly, testing the weight of it. "Family," James confirmed. "In whatever form that takes." The Westbrook house stood on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, its weathered shingles and wide porch speaking of summers long past. For 3 months it had been their refuge, a place of healing and recalibration. James sat on the porch steps, watching Theo and Beth comb the beach below for shells and sea glass. The summer had transformed his son, his skin sun-kissed, his confidence blooming under the freedom of days spent exploring tide pools and building elaborate sandcastles. Frank appeared from inside the house, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Mind if I join you?" James made room on the step. "Not at all." They sat in companionable silence, observing Beth teaching Theo how to skip stones across a tidal pool. "I've been thinking," James said finally, "about what happens when summer ends." Frank sipped his coffee. "And? We can't go back to our old lives. Not completely. Theo deserves the opportunities this inheritance provides." James paused. "But I don't want him growing up believing money is what defines his worth." "A wise concern," Frank nodded. "So what's your solution?" James had been contemplating this question for weeks, through long walks on the beach and quiet evenings on this very porch. "I want to establish a foundation," he said, "using part of the inheritance to create transitional housing for homeless individuals, particularly those with medical backgrounds who could be rehabilitated into the workforce." Frank's eyebrows rose. "Ambitious." "Necessary," James countered. "Beth's story isn't unique. There are countless qualified people who've lost everything due to circumstances beyond their control." "And who would run this foundation?" Frank asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Beth," James replied without hesitation. "She understands both worlds, healthcare and homelessness. She knows what works and what doesn't. Her compassion is matched by practical experience." Frank smiled, nodding slowly. "Have you discussed this with her yet?" "Not directly. I wanted to be certain of the legal framework first." James watched as Beth helped Theo collect a particularly beautiful shell. "She still believes she's temporary in our lives. I need to show her she's not." Below them, Theo's laughter carried on the breeze as Beth demonstrated how to listen for the ocean in a conch shell. The simple joy of the moment tightened James's throat. "You know," Frank said thoughtfully, "when I began searching for you and Theo, I was fulfilling an obligation to Margaret Harrison. I never expected to find a new purpose for myself." "And what purpose is that?" James asked. Frank's weathered hand gestured toward the beach. "Being part of something healing, something hopeful." He paused. "In my darkest days on the streets, hope was the scarcest commodity." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sand as Beth and Theo began making their way back toward the house, their pockets bulging with treasures from the shore. "I've made my decision," James said, rising to meet them, "about what happens next." That evening, after Theo was asleep upstairs in what had once been Emma's childhood bedroom, James unfolded architectural plans on the dining room table. Beth and Frank leaned forward, studying the drawings with curious expressions. "What's this?" Beth asked. The Harrison Foundation for Transitional Medical Housing, James replied. A place where healthcare workers who've experienced homelessness can rebuild their lives while using their skills to serve others? Beth's fingers traced the outline of the building, a former hotel the Harrison Trust owned, repurposed with residential units, medical facilities, and educational spaces. This is, her voice faltered. Ambitious, Frank supplied, echoing his earlier assessment. Necessary, James corrected again. And I want you to run it, Beth. She looked up sharply. Me? Who better? You've lived both realities. You understand? The challenges, the dignity every person deserves. James held her gaze steadily. You've been creating distance between us because you think your purpose in our lives is complete. I'm offering you a new purpose, one that honors what you've overcome and what you have to give. Beth's eyes filled with tears. James, I don't have the credentials anymore. My nursing license expired years ago. We'll fix that, he said simply. Frank's already explored the reinstatement requirements. Frank nodded. 6 months of supervised practice and continuing education credits, all manageable. Beth looked between them, overwhelmed. You've been planning this without me? Planning for you, James clarified gently. Because you're family, Beth. Not because of what you can do for us, but because of who you are to us. Outside, waves crashed against the shore. Constant, rhythmic, a reminder of how life continued to move forward even after devastation. James thought of Emma, wondering if she would approve of this new family they'd created, this mosaic of broken pieces reassembled into something unexpectedly beautiful. Theo will start school here in September, James continued, when Beth remained silent. The foundation headquarters will be in the city, but we'll keep this house, a place to come home to. Home, Beth repeated softly, the word carrying the weight of all she'd lost and found again. Frank cleared his throat. For what it's worth, I've agreed to serve as legal counsel for the foundation. Pro bono, of course. Beth laughed through her tears. Of course. As evening deepened into night, the three of them remained at the table, discussing possibilities that had seemed unimaginable months before. A foundation that would transform lives. A family constructed not from obligation or blood, but from choice and circumstance. 1 year later, James stood on the same porch, watching a very different scene unfold. On the lawn below, white chairs were arranged in neat rows beneath a canopy of autumn leaves. Theo, now 8, practiced walking solemnly down the makeshift aisle, Frank offering gentle guidance on pacing and posture. The Harrison Foundation had opened its doors 6 months earlier, with Beth as its executive director. Already 15 former healthcare workers had been rehoused and were working toward recertification. The local hospital had created a partnership program, offering supervised clinical hours to those rebuilding their careers. Beth emerged from the house behind him, wearing a simple cream dress, her hair caught up with sprigs of lavender. Nervous? James asked. About the ceremony? No. She smiled. About officially becoming Theo's legal guardian alongside you? Terrified in the best possible way? The adoption papers had been Frank's idea, a way to formalize what had already become true in their hearts. Not to replace Emma, whose presence remained honored in photographs and stories, but to acknowledge Beth's permanent place in their reconstructed family. He's so excited, James said. He's been practicing signing his name with both our surnames for weeks. Beth's eyes softened. Fletcher Morgan, it has a nice ring to it. Below them, Theo spotted Beth and waved enthusiastically. Mom, Grandpa, Frank says I'm a natural. The word still caught her by surprise sometimes, this title she'd never expected to earn. She waved back, joy illuminating her face. James watched them, this unlikely family created from loss and chance and choice. He thought of that desperate morning in the park years ago, when he'd handed his key to a homeless woman out of sheer necessity. How neither of them could have imagined where that simple act of trust would lead. "Every ending is a beginning," Frank had told them once. "And every stranger carries the potential to change your life." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the ocean in shades of gold and amber, James reflected on how true those words had proven. A homeless woman, a mysterious stranger, a forgotten inheritance. Each piece essential to the mosaic their lives had become. And on the beach below, the tide continued its eternal cycle, receding only to return, leaving the shore transformed with each passage, never quite the same, yet somehow exactly as it was meant to be.